Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on monitoring modern slavery in investment portfolios. The webinar is part of our wider research programme on modern slavery and human trafficking in the financial services industry, which is in partnership with the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and the Tribe Freedom Foundation. This research started in January, at the beginning of the year, and this webinar is one of a series of virtual roundtables looking at a range of different impacts of modern slavery in the financial sector. The project will culminate in a report published early next year. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour and will be available to download and watch again afterwards from our website. We'll begin with a discussion among the panelists, and then I'll put your questions up to them. So please send in your questions now or at any point during the webinar using the Q&A panel box on your screens. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists today. We have Marta Borchau, the Global Head of ESG Investment Solutions at Aviva Investors. Marta has worked with investors, business leaders and governments on sustainability issues for more than a decade in the UK and internationally. So welcome, Marta. Victoria Sant is a senior advisor at the Investor Forum. The Investor Forum is a not-for-profit organisation set up to facilitate collective engagements with UK listed companies. Welcome to Victoria. Matt Crossman is Stewardship Director at Rathbones, overseeing the work of the Responsible Investment Committee. Amongst other things, Matt has been leading investor engagement on combating modern slavery for many years. Catherine Bryant is lead of European engagement at the Walk Free Foundation and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. Catherine oversees Walk Free's research programme focused on what works to combat modern slavery, including assessing the effectiveness of mandatory reporting requirements. So welcome to all my panelists. To start, I'd like to get the ball rolling with a bit of audience participation. I'm going to launch a poll now, and if you could all participants could vote using the buttons on your screens. The question is, do investors have the ability to influence modern slavery and human trafficking practices within their portfolios? Yes or no? So please select one or other of the answers, and then we'll get the results in a few minutes once everyone has participated. So that is an overwhelming result. Yes, 100% of respondents said yes. I think it's fair to say that everybody on this webinar is interested and committed to tackling modern slavery. So perhaps not a surprising outcome there. But I think one of the findings that we found during our research for this project, we conducted some polling earlier this year, was that there were very low levels of awareness of modern slavery and human trafficking in this industry. And I wanted to start by asking Victoria, from your perspective at the Investor Forum, do you see lack of awareness as an obstacle to greater action in addressing the issue within the investment community?
Yeah, so I think to start with, the investment community encompasses a very wide range of investors, some who are only interested in those financial metrics and finding those growth and value opportunities. But increasingly, we're seeing stewardship and ESG concerns come to the main, and that be a real driver of returns and differentiation. But the key obstacle then is that there are so many issues that these ESG teams have to look at. As global investors investing in every part of the global economy, they're called upon to address every issue. So modern slavery is competing with climate change, diversity, deforestation, health and wellness, fair tax, a whole range of issues. So I think it's getting the time and attention of these teams who want to do the right thing, and anything that people can do to make it easy to give the right data, or the collective engagements will help raise the awareness.
Thanks, Victoria. I wanted to turn to Matt. Matt, the Modern Slavery Act has gone some way to raise awareness and put the issue on people's agendas. And Rathbone strongly supported the inclusion of the transparency and supply chain clause. Looking back over the last 5 years of the Act, what, in your view, is the power and value of modern slavery statements?
Yeah, thank you, Hope, and thanks everybody else for joining. It's really great to be with you today. You know, if I look back at 5 years of transparency in supply chains in the UK, I think I'd optimistically give the companies a C+ as a group, but I'd also question whether the teachers in the school did enough to set them up for success. There were no penalties for not attending the class, and we never actually got a formal confirmation of who was supposed to be in the class. So I think if we'd addressed those two key things, we might have got a bit further than we have. And of course, we've had the top of the class that we'd always expected have always gone further than the rest. You know, we made 4 key recommendations back to government last year when reflecting on the progress of transparency in supply chains. And I'll just restate them now because I think they're really basic and really important. I think the areas that are just suggested for reporting in the Act should be mandatory. I think we should have improved reporting on what effect those actions had. I think we should extend mandatory reporting to cover the public sector as well as the private sector. And we need a lot more clarity about exactly who's covered by these rules. And without those 4 questions being answered, I think we're not putting the tools in the right hands. We're not using them to the power that they greatly could. So yeah, I would say 5 years in with proof of concept, I think it has worked in certain examples. I can point to engagements that have gone to the next level through transparency in supply chains, but it's the end of the beginning as far as I can see.
Thanks, Matt. Victoria, I know that you've also, Catherine, you've also been working on statements. Would you like to add anything there?
I think just to furiously agree with Matt on all of those 4 points. And yeah, we at Walk Free have been looking at this statement since 2016, and we have found that there is low level of compliance with the minimum requirements within the legislation. And then if you drill down into sector specific risks, very few companies are actually really thinking about what risk means for their individual industry. So yes, I completely agree and would wholeheartedly agree with all of those recommendations, particularly around identifying who is reporting. Part of what we're doing at Walk Free is looking at sector-specific statements and trying to draw kind of a ring fence around who should be reporting is very, very, very difficult. I will say I am slightly more optimistic in terms of their usefulness, though. We have seen they have raised awareness, and they are meaning that people are having those conversations at the really senior executive level, because obviously they have to be signed off by the board and signed off by someone within the at the senior level. So that conversation is happening, and it has inspired some change in other countries. So Australia's put in place the Modern Slavery Act now, and we're starting to see that it's kind of starting to improve on some of the gaps in the UK legislation. In particular, there's an initiative called Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, which was launched last week, and investors have actually put out a statement about what they're requiring companies to report under the Australian Modern Slavery Act, and seeing as that there's a bit of an opportunity at this point. So I would agree, yes, there's definitely some improvements to be made, but they have been useful in some sense.
Thanks. Marta, would you like to add anything?
Just maybe talk a little bit about and reflect on what all of them have kind of talked about, which is ultimately it depends on the effectiveness of legislation, depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if the goal is disclosure, i.e. more transparency, then I think regulation can be a very effective tool. We've seen that work in a number of other areas like climate change, that if you make more reporting mandatory, then companies are going to start to disclose it and we get better data, etc. My main worry, back to Victoria's point, is the impact. You know, are we getting enough data on the actual outcomes of what's happening on the ground? So a good example, today the CHRB has launched their annual assessment of companies, and what we're seeing is that there's a lot of companies have improved on policies, on statements, etc. But when it comes to actual delivery on the ground, have they done due diligence? Have they actually remedied, you know, some of the problems that they've found in their supply chains? Much lower levels of compliance. In fact, we sent an investor letter out to more than 90 companies last year because they scored 0 on human rights due diligence, and this year 79 still score 0. So I think we need to think about the kind of power of regulation. It can be very good to raise awareness, to increase transparency, but I think my sort of hope is that sort of collaborative initiatives with investors like Matt and us, you know, leading companies, stakeholders, civil society and government, that's what you need. You need all of them to kind of come together to really push and get the actual impact on the ground. So that's what I would say. There's a little bit of a challenge of hoping that governments and regulation is going to solve all of it, but it can be very powerful.
Thank you. Victoria, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I would echo that all transparency is positive, but dealing with organised crime, I don't think a few words from the boardroom is enough to think that we can fix this just by having this statement. And so it's absolutely, what are the real world outcomes? And it's really easy to score highly, as we're finding out, on some of these ESG scores just by having the right policy. And if it doesn't translate to anything, then that's almost more of a risk than not saying anything in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to a recent case that's been in the media. I'm sure we're all aware of it. Over the past few months, the fast fashion industry has been in the news for its links to poor labour practices, particularly in Leicester. And there have also been reports of human rights abuses against the Uyghur community in China linked to cotton and fashion. Marta, if I could start with you, what do you think are the lessons that have been learned from particularly the Boohoo case for the investment community?
I think it might be, to Victoria's point, that the investor community needs to look underneath the bonnet of the information we're getting. And there are some investors who are lucky enough to have you know, big research departments that focus on sustainability, you know, that can actually take the scores, for example, that we're getting from some of the providers, but look underneath that and engage with the companies, try and get a real understanding of, you know, is the score actually reflective of actual practices on the ground, and then engage with the company to try and address it. I think what happened in the case of Boohoo, and that happens a lot, it's not just Boohoo, we see that all the time, is that companies are getting a simple score, and investors or even, you know, the broader public will be expecting that is well reflective of behaviors on the ground. So my only lessons would be, you know, investors need to have the resources in place to do the research, to do the engagement. Clients should be of investors. If you have a pension out there, you should be making sure that whoever you're investing in actually prioritizes that research and that actual engagement, which takes time, because it's the only way that you can actually find out what's happening. I think it also shows what we've discussed before, the potential weaknesses of legislation and having, you know, policies or statements in place. What we actually need to do is to figure out what's happening on the ground. And if I may add one final thing, I think we also need to learn from finding it. So one of the initiatives we're part of is an initiative led by the CCLA around finding it and fixing it and preventing it. So I think the worry for me in our sector is that as soon as someone does something wrong, it very quickly becomes into sort of a blame game where someone is very bad and everyone else are good. But I am sure that there are similar instances that happens across you know, most of these sectors, and so we need to not always blame, but try and understand and help to prevent it next time. So that is more of a call to all investors to engage and have that conversation and the dialogue with companies.
Absolutely. Companies and investors should be judged not by what they find, but how they respond to what they find. Matt, would you like to add anything to what Marta said?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the ESG ratings and leaning on them too much. Having multiple sources of information to help you view the risk holistically is what we're about. My only point to add there would be that you can't sleep on the business model. Doesn't matter how many kind of policies or nice statements on websites branded by the marketing department you have, if the fundamental economic incentives lead you towards exacerbating fast fashion supply chains, then, you know, the policies aren't worth the paper they're written on, in a way. So yeah, you do need that buy-in, that intangible thing, the culture at the board level, the culture of question, the culture of audit, etc., to actually follow through and view down those supply chains to the right degree. I think on the second point you mentioned the wider human risk there, and you asked the question, should investors take steps to call out poor practice when they see it? And I couldn't agree with Martin more. We were co-founders of that Find It, Fix It, Prevent It campaign with CCLA, and what we're trying to do there is change the conversation from that blame game to really engaging people to say, look, there are 40.3 estimated million people in the world engaged in human trafficking and forced labour. The assumption we have is that there is forced labour in your supply chain somewhere. It's up to you to disprove that presumption. And that is quite a bold change, actually, from the way that the industry is engaged with companies. And actually, we're seeing, even the companies that, historically didn't engage with us on this issue are coming around to it. Now, mainly what we've done there is we've started to engage with our votes. We've decided to start voting against the report and accounts of companies that we don't think are doing a good enough job on modern slavery reporting. And it's amazing how quickly you get a call from somebody who wasn't interested in speaking with you when you start voting against their report and accounts.
Indeed. Victoria, would you like to add something there?
Yeah, so as you'd expect from the Investor Forum, we're a big fan of collaborative, collective engagements, and we believe there's power in working together at a pre-competitive level. And I think that's true for companies as well, that a lot of initiatives are out there for companies to work together to address the issues which are systemic within their sector, be that Fast Forward, or the BRC, Better Retail, Better World, ETI, all of these groups where people are coming together. And I think with hindsight, Boohoo wasn't part of any of these, and people like ASOS and M&S and those best practice leaders had come together to do things. And I wonder whether in future those will be more of a red flag than they have before, in that the best minds of the industry are getting together to work to address something that not one of them can fix alone. And if you're on the outside and you feel that this is not my problem or I don't want to contribute, perhaps that says something about the culture of the company or the lack of awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to come back to the point of challenging companies to find it and then fix it. If you do have the assumption that there are things in the supply chain, what do you think? And this is a question to all of you. What do you think are the barriers to finding it? Is it lack of resources? Is it a lack of will? Is it, what do you think are the barriers to companies finding these things or even starting to look for them? Catherine, maybe you'd like to.
Yeah, I can start that. I think, lack of will be probably one of the key things. We've been very open about the fact that modern slavery, forced labour exists in all global supply chains. We're very lucky to be funded and founded by a West Australian businessman who's very open about that. But we still find time and time again, people in looking at their statements as just one avenue for disclosure, saying, well, we have all these mechanisms in place, we have these policies, but we've never found any issues, we've never had anything, so therefore we've ticked that box and we can move on. So I think it's about having that space to disclose those forms of those incidents, and then also really thinking through how to remediate as well. That information is also not often very clearly shared within the statements. And I think one of the key things that we're seeing more and more is the importance of this kind of sector wide collaboration, and also looking at multi-stakeholder initiatives and drawing on the expertise of others. Some of the most successful multi-stakeholder initiatives we've seen draw on civil society, for example, who have a lot of this information, who have this data, who can then share this and work with companies to provide them with the solutions in sense of providing remediation and also finding it in the first place.
Thanks, Catherine. Marta, would you like to add something?
Just to add on to the point about the value of civil society organisations. I mean, we find that when it comes to the sort of plethora of information that's out there on performance of companies, very often the early warning signals, we tend to get that from civil society organisations. And frankly, a challenge to us as an industry is how much do we value it? How do we pay for it? Very often that information is given to us as investors and as companies for free. Whilst we spend vast amount of sums of money buying in research on the financial impact of companies, and we did a survey a couple of years ago that showed that a lot of the research we're paying for doesn't actually look at those issues, but the free research, the publicly available research that we get from these organizations is hugely valuable. And so maybe there's something that our industry, I think, needs to go a bit back around the circles and think, how can we actually support those civil society organizations that are on the ground more, so that we can continue to sort of reap the benefit of the value they add for us. I think one of the options is, which we've tried to do with the World Benchmarking Alliance that we've been part of founding, is trying to set up organizations that allows us all to collaborate, so that we can help pay for some of that original research, but we create sort of collaborative spaces. In Norway, we call it a dugnad, and it's an Asian sort of Viking word for when you got together to sort of build a house together. You know, some new person had come and joined your village, and you needed to build a house, so you all got together and you helped that one person in the kind of assumption that you would get help back in return. I think what we need is more dugnads around the table, where we work with civil society, we help them and they help us in return. So hopefully that's a bit of a call, including to my organisation, to make sure we properly value the voices that we can get from those organisations and the information they give us.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have another question which I was going to introduce later, but around the ESG indices that have been mentioned already and the quality of the data. And my question is, if the majority of that information that feeds into those indices is coming from the companies themselves, if it's self-disclosure, how are the voices of the victims being heard? And if we're talking about modern slavery and we're talking about people in factory workers or agricultural workers, how is their voice fed into that index? And you've talked about civil society and the CHRB, but I wonder if there are other mechanisms that can be drawn on to bring in, to make sure that it's balanced and it's really representative. Matt, would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I haven't necessarily got any solutions to that problem. It's something we've known about for a long time. It's one of the reasons we've been encouraging exactly what Victoria recommended, that collaboration at industry level, to pool efforts there to make sure that transparency goes right down all the levels, all the tiers of the supply chain. One problem that's been really exacerbated by the pandemic is this whole area, because we've had international travel restricted, we've had lack of ability of third-party auditors to get on the ground and actually investigate. So not necessarily got any solutions, just to say it's probably worse than you make out actually hope at the moment. I think we're reliant on that change in attitude at company level, where they can not have fear of kind of chastisement, but to actually look to partners in the investment community, in the third sector, who can actually almost reward them for going out and finding it and reporting what they did to fix it. And I think that aligns really well with the whole business and human rights agenda. The idea under the guiding principles that you provide access to remedy, for example, is something that we're looking to encourage as a response to this. There's no easy answers, unfortunately, I hope.
Victoria, do you have anything more to say about that?
Yeah, so another initiative that we've been involved in is around ground truthing and getting the view on the ground up to the top of the tier one client, many miles away, and how you make that connection. And I think in the UK supply chain, if it's just a client in a tier one, it's much easier to do. But where it's a globally diverse, getting those voices needs that local trust, and that needs to feed into kind of the global NGOs and bring the voice back again. And so I think when we're looking at any human rights issue, I think getting the truth from the ground in a way that is not distorted by political agendas or by campaign agendas, but is valid, and for investors to hear that, and for the boardrooms of the top co to hear it as well, is really important.
Great, thank you. Catherine, yes.
Sorry, can I just quickly jump in there? Just to say that, just echo the importance of worker voice to ground truth, as you were saying, Victoria, this disclosure. There are a couple of initiatives out there, something called Fashion Checker, which looks at suppliers and then also does surveys with workers to actually look at what's happening on the ground, so that you can then cross-reference that, and they map it all the way back up to the brand for the fashion industry, so you can actually start to see what is being disclosed at the company level, and then what's the reality of the suppliers on the ground. So there are very few initiatives. Tony's Chocolonely, a chocolate company, also takes action on doing this kind of ground truthing, but they are very few and far between. And I think that's kind of the next step, to try and see what is the impact of these mandatory reporting requirements, to see if they are actually effective.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm now going to ask the audience to participate in another poll. Lizzie, if we could have the next poll up, please. The question is, this is around engagement or divesting. We've touched on engagement already. The question is, if an investor finds evidence of modern slavery in one of its investee companies, should it engage or divest? And we are getting some votes in now. So we've got 67%, 70% have voted, participants, and it's a split 76% engaged, 24% divest. Thank you all for voting. I'd now just like to ask the panelists on this question. We've talked about engagement, and I know that in the case of Boohoo, there were some divestments made. Marta, if I could start with you, what is your take on this question? It's a tricky one.
Well, I thought that might be more controversial than, I mean, if 76% says that they believe in engagement, that's actually quite a hopeful comment in my opinion. So often when I'm speaking at events, I say that I believe in engagement rather than divestment, and I come back to kind of the the economist Hirschman who talked about, if you're unhappy about something, how do you show that to someone? You can either voice your view or you can exit. And I mean, as a citizen, we often face that. You may disagree with the current government, or you may disagree with certain things that happens in your country, and you can either leave or you can stay and try and voice and for as long as you can. And I really do truly believe in the value of engagement. I think that we should do it more. I think if more investors actually spent the time, because it's resource intensive to engage well, if more investors did that well, I think we would have a lot more impact, and we've seen it work. However, there needs to be a pathway, an escalation pathway for that to be credible. So a good example is, I mean, we've done this in a very different area around climate change, where 5 years ago we started saying we were going to engage with coal companies. And a lot of people said to us, I mean, that's nuts, no coal company is going to change, coal is dead. And to be honest, a lot of them never did, and so we've ended up putting them on a divestment list. But there were quite a few, more than we thought, and more than I think we were told, who actually have committed to phasing out coal. And that shows the power of, daring to ask the difficult questions. And I think we should kind of, I'll just leave people with a thought that we're all trying to do our best, but I don't think there is rarely such a thing as a good person or a totally bad person. I mean, there might be some that are really, really bad, but generally when it comes to companies, most of them have improvement potential, and most of them are doing maybe something good in one area, but doing then something quite bad in another area. There might be renewable energy companies, phenomenal work on low carbon, but actually their human rights due diligence may not be up to scratch. For me, we can't just walk away. I think we need to remain invested, but maybe with a bit of a timeline and a deadline, so that if they don't change, there will be some action.
Yeah. Can I jump in here? Is that okay?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So Marta, I usually quote Albert Hirschman as well. So you beaten me to it there. Exit, voice, and loyalty. So in order to lower the tone, I'm going to quote somebody else, which is Apu from The Simpsons. So there's an amazing episode of The Simpsons where Homer wants to win a golden ticket or a lottery ticket, and he basically breaks into Apu's convenience store and scratches off the tickets before buying them in order to guarantee that he wins. And Apu comes up to him and says, "Mr. Simpson, I've asked you nicely once before to leave the store and desist this activity, and you leave me no option but to ask you nicely once again." And I think that sums up a lot of investor engagement in this area, particularly around, dare I say it, some of the more passive area of the industry that have engaged in this whole human rights agenda. Engagement needs to have consequences. We can't get away from that as a thing. So if you ask me, is it engagement or divestment? I say yes. A combination of both. Your engagement has to have consequences. Is that all right to lower the tone and mention The Simpsons? I don't know if I've just completely undermined my professional standing, but if I can't quote Albert Hirschman, then
Simpsons.
That's perfect. Maybe I can come in again, and given the forum does collective engagement, you'll not be surprised to know that I'm a big believer in engagement, but absolutely with consequences and with asking for evidence and having a clear ask, not just saying, oh, please will you get better, but I think this is what we expect to see from you, real clear expectations of changes at the board, changes of policies, changes of culture, and it's much harder to be able to assess that. But saying to them, these are the insights that we're getting on your company, this is what we want to see change over, and it's hard to see over what time frame they should do it, what's reasonable, but I think if you want to go with them on that journey and stay invested, you have to make them institutional investor quality. If they're a listed company, you know, they have a position on the market, we have to uphold those standards, I think. And doing it collectively can stop that divide and rule that companies can do, or you're the only investor that cares about this, but, you know, being able to say this is a real market concern and kind of coach them through it and help them get better. And I think that investors do have a role in that. But if there aren't changes, then I think exit can be very valid, as well as to say, you haven't met my expectations, it's too much for risk for me to remain invested.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Catherine, did you want to say anything about engagement?
Just to echo that continuous engagement would be definitely where we would land on this. And you can see the negative impacts of divestment. If you take the Boohoo example, obviously the share price dropped and then other investors came in and invested in the company. So, you know, that was not doing the right thing in that sense. So, and it can have negative consequences, obviously, on the individuals who are actually being exploited. I would just say, to go back to the UN guiding principles on this, you know, obviously continuous engagement is where we should be aiming, or we should be aiming for. But ultimately, if there's going to be no improvement and there's no opportunity to improve, then the UN guiding principles do allow for that, you know, disengagement with companies. And we've been seeing that, for example, in the Xinjiang province in China, with the use of state and post-forced labor with the Uyghur population, that, you know, there is very limited other opportunities. Therefore, we would recommend at that point to cancel contracts and to move out of the region. So yeah, so that, you know, that has to be that last resort of, you know, taking really concrete action, as well. Otherwise you end up, as you say, continually engaging to no real end.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to pick up on the point that was raised a few minutes ago about industry collaboration. And I've spoken with some of you before about the difference between the high-profile nature of the climate change debate within the investment community and the sort of human rights agenda. And the industry seems to have really come together around climate change. And I wonder what your thinking is about where it's heading on human rights, and in particular modern slavery, and whether there might be some sort of coming together around this issue at some point in the future. Marta, could I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be hopeful, I guess. So I'm going to say yes, and I think that 2021, we're already starting to see it, actually, and I think 2021 will be a very important year for human rights and modern slavery. So, you know, it's the UN Working Group on Human Rights is looking backwards on the last 10 years and seeing what's you know, what has been the impact of the Ruggie principles, and where do we move from here? What are we going to do in the next 10 years? And hopefully, as Matt said, you know, getting more clearer KPIs, more clearer targets, if not a Paris Agreement, then some kind of clarity that in terms of what we're expecting from companies. And so I'm pretty hopeful that with a little bit more clarity on the global scene, it will help us as investors to join together and create a sort of, you know, human rights 100 like we've done on climate change. So I'm going to just vote for being hopeful.
Great. Matt, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting one to reflect on. You know, you would argue that the sudden change in kind of climate awareness, you know, it wasn't like the science changed miraculously. You know, from what I studied at university to 15 years later, when suddenly David Attenborough and plastics and everything, and suddenly it's Greta and, you know, everybody cares about it. Actually, there's an interesting study there, isn't there, about, you know, how these social attitudes build and then suddenly go through a tipping point. And then you wonder, why haven't we had the ocean plastics moment for human rights? When I first started in the industry, it was all about Nike and footballs, and we've had Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, and we've had any number of potential trigger moments which could have captured the public imagination, but it hasn't quite translated through into that concerted, focused action. And I wonder if there are structural factors at play there. I wonder if climate has managed to move up the agenda because at a fundamental level, the problem is carbon emissions, they're quantifiable. The idea is, it's incredibly difficult to think about carbon budgets, but at least there's no debate about, numbers on a page. Whereas when it comes to human rights, particularly at international level, let's be clear that there is not consensus about what certainly at international administration, nation state level, what contributes good behaviour as regards respecting human rights beyond the kind of UNDHR. If you asked the Chinese embassy what was going on in northwest China, they would defend it. If you asked what was going on in Egypt or Turkey, you would get a very different answer to the administrations in Ukraine. As much as we want there to be common ground, sadly there isn't. So we do come up against those barriers, and that's something we have to be very aware of. And thankfully, that is where the business and human rights agenda can come in and be that kind of central arbiter of what we think basic respect for human rights should be. And the business community can be part of bringing that baseline expectation that I believe everybody should have into economic life and the normal life of everyone around the world, really. So yeah, I think we are getting there. I think we are seeing a tipping point. And just my final reflection on this question would be, the ESG industry groups that I'm part of, we're all talking about social this year. We're all talking about social definitions and things we should be expecting of all companies. And it's to the point from the third sector organisations, worker voice, community investment, all these things, they're coming back to the fore. We recognise that perhaps the pendulum swung too far to the E of the ESG, and that we need to be asking more serious questions about the S.
Thank you. Fascinating. Let's hope we are heading in that direction. Catherine, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just say that definitely I think there is increasing pressure to focus on the S of the ESG. And that's coming from lots of different places. I mean, we touched on regulation, but there are an awful lot more regulatory frameworks that have come in the last couple of years, and also more coming down the pipelines with the EU directive on human rights due diligence next year. You've obviously seen UK, Australia, French legislation, so on and so forth. I also think there is an increasing demand from investors to start to focus on this, and that's going to have the real kind of impact on company behaviour. And I would say, perhaps controversially, that I think the Australian investor community is perhaps a little bit ahead of the game in terms of how it's engaging with this issue. The statement that they released and really clarifying what their expectations are for companies reporting under the Australian Modern Slavery Act is really explicit about the fact for the need to focus on modern slavery and human rights. And so I think that you're right, that pendulum is swinging towards that. It does dishearten me somewhat to think that we do care a lot more about the environment than humans, but I think we are kind of starting to get to the right space there in terms of looking at human rights as being really fundamental to what we're doing in the business space. And yes, business and human rights is going to be the focus of that.
And I think the boardroom as well is shifting to incorporate these things. The boards themselves are thinking about purpose. They're thinking about not just their financial capital, but their natural capital and their human capital, and how they can manage these things. And in the UK, where you have employee directors, you're trying to connect the board much more to the operational part of the business. And so I think while investors are engaging with the board, they appoint those people onto the board. And so the change is being driven by companies as well as investors, and kind of that's something to do together.
Great, thank you. We're just coming to the end of our discussion, and then I will open up for some questions. So I'd like to just ask you all one final question. We're all here today because we are, committed to human rights and business and combating modern slavery, but unfortunately not everybody out there is as passionate as we are. And I'd just like to hear from each of you what would be your message to those skeptics out there. And unfortunately, as we've been researching this project, we have spoken to people who have said, this has nothing to do with me, this doesn't affect my work at all. What do you say to those people? Victoria, maybe I could start with you.
Yeah, so I think a company's social license to operate will increasingly be reflected in its PE, which is the financial reflection of the value that you're going to get from this company in the future. And so while their profits might be one thing, the multiple that you're prepared to pay for them is based on your confidence in the ability of the company to be sustainable over the long term and have good governance and to do the right thing by all its stakeholders to justify that. So I think it is increasingly being priced into the financial markets, and that you can't just ignore a whole section of the information that you're getting just because it doesn't fit your narrative, because I think so many people are beginning to, and consumers are beginning to, and politicians are telling you that you have to as well. So I think the old days of really just looking at the balance sheet and coming up with your assessment of value for a company are over, and you need to get with that new narrative of how the financial markets work.
Thank you. Catherine.
I think kind of my call to action for investors is to consider human rights, modern slavery and investment decisions, and disclose that as well. So one of the things I mentioned, we've been looking at the statements produced by different sectors. The investor community is going to be the next sector that we look at Walk Free, and we're going to be looking for how people are defining risk beyond their supply chains to actually looking at investment decisions. And I would say the need to act is kind of already here. As I mentioned, those frameworks exist, those regulations exist, legislation's there. There's also this idea of, so there's kind of a compliance risk, there's a brand risk, and also the, supply chains or companies that are built on forced labor are ultimately built on unsustainable earnings. And so forth, there needs to be some kind of switch there to focus on this particular issue. And then the last thing is that there is this fiduciary duty for investors to actually look at modern slavery. So that's something else that we need to be considering.
Thank you. Matt, what's your comment?
Yeah, so we released a report about 18 months ago called Responsible Capitalism, and if I had to sum it up, it would be this: you should care about this stuff even if you don't. And it's basically a reflection that this ESG agenda is so financially material, and the benefits of a proactive approach of dealing with it are such that it builds strength and adaptability within your supply chain that secures everybody's investments. If we think there are 40.3 million people in situations of forced labor and human trafficking, you extrapolate that out to an illegal business worth an estimated $150 billion a year, according to the ILO. Actually, this is all stuff that's lost to the formal economy. So even if you don't care about it from a baseline citizenship point of view or a human rights point of view, you should care about it as an investor, as a business, as a taxpayer, dare I say it. So yeah, I think it's one of these rare areas where I think action and engagement is a win-win. Investors want to see it, your customers want to see it, everybody involved around your business is going to congratulate you for taking action on something like this, I think. So yeah, I think it's the ultimate win-win, honestly, taking action on supply chains.
Thank you. Martin.
Just building on what Matt said, and I completely agree with everything he said, so I'm not going to repeat it because I couldn't agree more. But building on the customer voice that you mentioned there, I think a huge pressure point for investors and companies are going to start to come from their customers. And we're seeing, I'm not saying it's always the case, but we're seeing a lot of our customers asking us questions about people, social issues, human rights issues in their portfolio. And as we're democratizing sort of investments, I hope that everyone who's listening in today, for example, you should all go and find out where your money is going. What's your pension provider doing? If you've got a savings account in a bank, where's that money going? And we did it as an example of the power of technology in that space. So we did a pilot with a very exciting startup called Tumelo, and they basically bring to life your portfolio. So it shows you your investment, not like a boring graph of kind of difficult words that's impossible to understand. It actually shows to you, brings to life which companies are you supporting, what are they doing, how are they ranked, and then it also shows voting and engagement, and it lets people be a part of having influence with their money. So if that's where we're heading, a bit like how we've seen technology disrupt a lot of other industries, I hope that investment is going to get disrupted, and I hope consumers can have a voice. And I think as soon as they do, none of them would appreciate their money being invested into companies, and at least not without engagement, into companies that are not treating people properly. And so I would just say, you know, all of us can play a role in that. That would be my call to action. Go out and find out where your money is going.
Great, well, thank you. Let's hope that everyone's listening to that. I'm now going to open up for questions, and there have been a number of questions that have been coming in while we've been chatting. The first question is directed to Matt, and the question is, what role, if any, do you think the IAS, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, could play in the reporting against the Modern Slavery Act to support companies going from what you described as C+ to A*? So what role could the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner play in helping that that transition from C to A?
Well, tragically, we had a fantastic project lined up to work with the Office of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, but then there was a big transition in the actual role of the Commissioner itself, and that project fell through. I think they have a really important role. I think to provide that continuity beyond the political cycle is really important. And we look forward to joining with them in, they encouraged us in our Votes Against Slavery project, this idea where we vote against the annual report and accounts where people aren't reporting well enough. I think they have a huge role to play, not just at the ground level in terms of highlighting areas around the policing aspect of it, but they have always engaged with us in the investment community, and we look forward to working with them in a greater way in future.
Great, thanks, Matt. There's a question for Catherine here. Based on Walk Free's analysis to date, what are the key gaps in modern slavery reporting by investors?
It's a good question. So we've just started looking at the Modern Slavery Act statements being produced by investors. And so I'm not in a position to give you all of the findings just yet, but I will say that the initial kind of sense we're getting is that investors in their disclosures are only thinking very narrowly in terms of modern slavery risk. They're thinking about their direct operations. So often the statements will report things around employees being, treated fairly by the actual investor. Also looking maybe at supply chains and thinking about, the cleaning company that perhaps cleans the office or catering they've used for events, but then kind of stopping there in terms of understanding risk. Very few investors are actually starting to think about their investment portfolio as a source of risk. And so that's something that we're going to be encouraging when we release the findings next year. Beyond that, what we've also found is that it's really difficult to identify investors, and particularly those that fall in the scope of the Modern Slavery Act. There is a part of the legislation that talks about the threshold of £36 million per annum and says that that's related to income from services and goods, not from investment income, which then means that some investors believe they shouldn't be reporting or shouldn't actually be reporting. So that's one thing we're going to be focusing on in terms of trying to close that loophole in the legislation.
Thank you. I have a question here for Victoria, which is talking about consumers versus investors. It says, are investors less likely to detect and prevent modern slavery in their portfolio if consumers seem unfazed? So referring back to the Boohoo case, where what do profits tell us about the interplay between consumer and investor approaches?
Yes, it's interesting that is it only material if it moves the share price? And historically, I think a lot of investors would say, well, our material issues are the capital allocation, the strategic direction, and things that can hit profits. And so you might say that this can hit near-term profits, but their customers kept on buying online in this case. But I think it's that sustainability and the reputation of the brand and its longevity, and whether it's material or not, if it's still the wrong thing to do, if it's still illegal, it's still exposing you to other risks which might be financial down the line. And as a governance of the company, if it's taking shortcuts in one area or taking risks in one area that you weren't aware of, I think it should make you start asking, what else don't I know? What else are they not on top of in the right way? So I think it can, even if you don't see an immediate short-term impact like we did with Boohoo, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be concerned about other aspects that are going wrong in the company.
Absolutely.
And just to add one thing that Victoria mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of investors out there, even though it's a sort of small trend, it is strengthening. There's a lot more demand for impact investing. So that means you almost sort of managing money towards multiple dimensions, not just return, but also wanting to have a positive impact. And so you know, as we all play a role in, you know, making funds like that more available, encouraging more impact investing, where you will look not just at the immediate financial return, but also having a you know, building a future that we can actually retire into. I always often say that it doesn't really matter if we got fantastic returns for the next sort of 5 to 10 years time, if by the end we're going to retire, we end up not having a planet at all. So, you know, we need to really think about having a positive impact and pushing harder for that. And I think we're seeing a lot of our customers and clients wanting to do that. And in that case, it does, you know, yes, it's financially material, but actually companies who want to get into those portfolios are going to have to meet a much higher threshold for the kind of goods and services that they provide and produce.
Thank you. You mentioned impact investing there, and there's another question here asking about responsible investment and ethical funds. Does that imply that all the other funds are irresponsible and unethical? And when are we going to move away from this idea of sustainability and human rights as being a niche concern, and seeing the entire industry looking at these as material issues, you know, relating to governance and long-term success, as you've all mentioned? Marta, would you like to carry on from what you were just mentioning?
Yeah, I'll be brief, and then Matt, I'm sure, can add a bit more. So, I mean, I always talk about sustainable investing a little bit like a supermarket. So, you know, some people might be vegan and want to buy vegan funds because that's what they don't want to be associated with certain things. Some people will want to buy maybe organic, etc. But for me, it's really important that every single you know, fund that an asset manager has in their portfolio should essentially be responsible. So you don't want to say, here's my sort of perfect coffee and here's my terrible coffee. You want to say all of our coffee meets a certain level of baseline, i.e., for example, integration of research, making sure we're engaging. So when we go out and engage with companies, we do that on behalf of all of the assets that we manage. But there might be some people who are willing to take a slightly different risk and have a different, you know, maybe more of a long-term horizon when they're with impact in mind.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. Sorry, my wife and son just arrived and put their heads around the window, just interrupting. Sorry about that. I think certain issues obviously have made the journey from fringe to material, haven't they? We chatted about climate change earlier on, but I think there were always going to be emerging ESG issues which the specialist funds are going to spot and manage better and first. So, you know, we started talking about cyber risk and cyber technology sort of 10 years ago, and now that's a mainstream risk. So I think there's always going to be a role for, you know, more pioneering niche funds. We've got our Rathbone Greenbank bit of the business, for example. As we're trying to move our whole business into the more sustainable, more responsible area, we're keeping that area of the business moving forward too. And yeah, to Marta's point, you know, there's different definitions of sustainable as there are kind of shades of grey, really. Nuclear for some people is brilliant, for other people is a gross environmental crime. I think we have to be encouraged by the way in which this discussion is happening. You know, when I started working with Rathbone Greenbank, when I started my career in 2004, we were 120 million out of 6 billion. Now that business is near enough 2 billion, and the whole business is 50 billion. It's a great problem to have, in a way, to be having this discussion, I think.
Would anyone else like to add anything to that discussion?
No, I agree with Marta that you should have different products to reflect an investment belief, and that's what makes a market. You need buyers and sellers of everything, and you can target value stocks or growth stocks or just passive index. And I think managers out there can create, and there is a market for stewardship now, and this is a competitive advantage for some people to do it well, and it will attract more clients, and they will see capital flowing that way, which, you know, creates the virtuous circle. So you almost need the bad behavior, the old-fashioned way of doing things in order for the good guys to outperform.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and this is a question around the relationship between the press and announcements or discoveries. Sometimes investors are nervous of press reactions to a particular scandal that will then drive consumer behavior. if an investor is going to engage, how do they navigate this minefield?
I'll chip in quickly on that
Yes,
one.
let's start with Matt.
Yeah. Don Draper in Mad Men said, if you don't like what people are saying about you, change the conversation. And I think getting out ahead of these things by stating we're looking for modern slavery, we know it exists, and we're going to go look for it, and that being the message, controlling the narrative, kind of disempowers the negativity, I think, around it. There's a certain bravery that comes with that, but we have seen companies, take that stance and be rewarded for it. So yeah, I think it's there. Don't stick your head in the sand, kind of grasp it and go and have your chance to control the narrative is the way that we recommend kind of our investee companies to go about it.
I think that's right. And I think Boohoo in some ways was really brave to publish the entire findings of the independent review, because they weren't pretty reading, and that's not really what you want in the press. But if you don't do it, it looks like you've got something else to hide. And putting it out there and saying, and now we know, everybody knows what we're dealing with, is that first acceptance of the problem, isn't it? And then it allows you to move on together. So I think, yes, as Matt said, controlling the narrative and being authentic in your response to it, rather than just making grand promises that you can't keep. Managing the expectations around it is really important. And for investors to say, oh gosh, we were surprised, but we're going to engage again, or we've talked to them about this before, and we knew that this was a risk, is also important, rather than saying, the same way for companies, there's no company in my portfolio that can ever do anything wrong because I know everything, is really dangerous.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I think for investors, continually engaging and starting from the point of view of there probably is a slavery risk in my investments, and therefore I need to be doing more to investigate that, and then work with the companies of how to mitigate those risks, rather than starting from the point of view of there's no problem, therefore being surprised when it does get released. So yeah, that would be definitely the recognizing that this is an issue and then really actively engaging would be my kind of response to that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for participating in this webinar discussion today. It's been really fascinating, and there are so many things that I'd like to listen to again. The webinar has been recorded, so anybody can listen to it again, or anyone who missed it, or you want to share it with anyone, please feel free to do so. We didn't have time to get through all the questions, but thank you to all our listeners for sharing questions and for participating in the polls. I think I'm hearing that 2021 is going to be the year of business and human rights, and engagement is top of the agenda. So some really encouraging thoughts to take away from that discussion, and some great quotes, not least from The Simpsons. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.